I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And of course, as always, joined today by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Got you right here on the phone line, Liz. We have two cases to discuss today, both of which people should know about, at least some of the players in those cases. First of all, Frances Hall is out of jail. Tell me about it.
Yes, Chance. Great to be here with you on Monday morning. Probably the big news from over the weekend and from late last week was that Frances Hall, the San Antonio wife who was convicted in 2016 of killing her trucking magnate husband, Bill Hall Jr., was released from prison on Friday. She, as you know, we've discussed her numerous times on the podcast because this was a case from 2013 where Frances Hall, her husband Bill Hall Jr., and his lover of 3 years, Bonnie Contreras, became involved in a highway chase that ended with the death of Bill Hall Jr. Well, this case has been covered nationally and internationally, and at least from the local perspective, it's been one subject that has been discussed over and over again, on both sides of the aisle, where you have people who talk about, a woman who was basically driven possibly to such a rage that someone died in the course of her trying to talk to her husband's mistress. And then you have the other aspect of it where the reality is that during this murder trial, where she was convicted in 2016, the jury was able to consider a sudden passion defense. And what that did, as you'll recall, is that her first degree punishment for murder, which is 5 to 99 years or life in prison, for the punishment of this particular case, it was reduced to a second degree felony punishment for sudden passion. So that was a 2 to 20 year range. And I believe that after hearing her testimony in the punishment phase of her trial, that the jury was definitely moved. And when the defense asked for them to show mercy, they gave her 2 years in prison on each of the charges of murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon for allegedly ramming the vehicle that was being driven by Bonnie Contreras. So yes, she had a homecoming on Friday. She was released from the Crane unit in Gatesville, which is about 40 miles west of Waco, into a waiting car that contained family members who were going to bring her back to the San Antonio area to her home in Helotes for a family dinner to celebrate her release from prison. So I would hope, Chance, that we would have a chance to come back and talk with Frances Hall about the case. It was one that I received emails and letters from women across the state who could relate to, having a situation where there was an infidelity in a relationship, not so much the murder. I didn't, thank goodness I didn't get a lot of correspondence from people, cheering on that someone, was killed. But she definitely received a lot of support and continues to.
So obviously, as you just mentioned, Elizabeth, a lot of people are interested in this case. I'm wondering what the people who actually worked on this case have to say about Frances Hall now being out of jail.
Yes, it was on Friday. I had an opportunity to talk to several people who were involved in the case. I spoke with Judge Jefferson Moore, who presided over the trial in the 186th State District Court, and asked him, what his thoughts were. And Judge Moore he said he's presided over 60 trials since he was elected to the bench in 2015. And one of the things that he said stood out to him was that this trial was so crowded every single day. Both sides of the courtroom were packed each day of the trial. And specifically on the day that they had closing arguments in the first phase and really also in the second phase of the trial, it was so crowded in their chance that Judge Moore had to let the gallery spill over into the hallway in the last days, of that trial, because, he said that he has a duty to the public to provide a public trial. So, I mean, you're talking people shoulder to shoulder in there on both sides. And there were even attorneys that were actually sitting, within the court area where other attorneys are investigators as well, sitting behind the tables where the attorneys that are arguing the case usually sit. So he basically had to have bailiffs in the hallway in front of his courtroom to keep the area quiet so that the people outside could hear. And sometimes when attorneys argue, the judge will give them each about an hour apiece on each side to argue. And usually during that time, you may have a little bit of up and down in the gallery, people coming in and out. Sometimes, people are coming in to meet with their attorneys, or, other attorneys are coming in to talk to people about their cases. But in this particular case, according to Judge Moore, and I remember this like it was yesterday, nobody moved or said anything for 2 hours during the closing arguments in this case. You could have heard a pin drop. And in discussing this with the prosecutor in the case, Scott Simpson was the lead prosecutor with Stephanie Paulison, and Scott Simpson said Friday that, she served her time and that he wished her well. And, he definitely said that the jury had made their decision, and he just wished her well. And her defense attorneys, which Frances Hall had 4 of them, all of them basically felt that she was innocent, which she pled in court, that she was innocent of murder, that this was a tragic accident that happened. Jean Brown, one of the defense attorneys who defended Frances Hall, along with her husband, Alan Brown, and Lee Cutter and Adam Cortez, basically the main theme from them was that she has, she gets to start her life back again. She gets to rebuild it. Jean Brown called her a wonderful woman. Alan Brown said that there was no criminal intent. And Adam Cortez, who had filed a motion earlier this year with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals seeking a new trial on Frances Hall's behalf, and that particular request was withdrawn in July, still maintains that he believes that she didn't get a fair trial, and that instead of celebrating her release on Friday, that her family really should have been celebrating 2 years ago an acquittal, because he really does not believe that she intended to kill her husband. And Lee Cutter, we had a very nice conversation as well. She has actually history with Frances Hall is different from the other attorneys, because she was actually still a law clerk the day after this incident occurred. So this was probably one of the biggest cases that Lee Cutter has had since she has been a lawyer. So she has more of a kinship, and said that she views Frances Hall as family, because in the 4 years that she's had association with her, not only has she gotten to know the Hall family and Frances in particular, but she said, as much as I was there for her, she was there for me through a marriage, the birth of 2 children, and a divorce. So, you kind of have a lot of emotions around this particular case in San Antonio. So, this is an ending for Frances Hall in regards of how she has paid her debt to society with the conviction that she had, and now she gets to be a free woman.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. And of course, we'll follow this case, and if there are any more developments, we'll talk about it right here on The Docket. We're about halfway through today's episode, Elizabeth. Let's go to our second case. A crucial player in the downfall of Mark Benavides, someone who we've definitely talked about before, was convicted last week in Bexar County on intoxication manslaughter. This is actually her second conviction for this crime. So please explain how that's the case, and then, of course, what she now faces in the sentencing phase that should begin later today.
Well, yes, Chance. Well, this is definitely, we're going to have probably an answer soon as to what happens in this case. This is a 30-year-old woman who we're not identifying because she was the victim of sexual assault. Now, she was convicted Friday of intoxication manslaughter in a fatal motor vehicle pedestrian crash that happened in 2013. This woman was driving on the far west side down Ray Ellison Drive. This was the morning after Father's Day in 2013. And a dad, his wife, and their teenage son were walking on the shoulder of Ray Ellison Drive. And they were doing the right thing because they were headed in the direction of traffic. And, when you're, as far as like road rules, you're supposed to ride your bike or walk in that direction. They were hit from behind by a vehicle allegedly driven by this woman, and the man named Charles White died at the hospital later that day. His wife Priscilla was injured and she was treated but released, and their son Anthony was not hurt, but he was 13 at the time, and he witnessed this tragic event. So what happened back right after this occurred was the woman was represented by Mark Benavides, who you'll recall is the former San Antonio defense attorney and judicial candidate who ended up earlier this year being convicted of continuous trafficking of persons and sentenced to 80 years in prison for coercing clients that he represented in drug and prostitution cases. He coerced them into having sex with him in exchange for keeping them out of jail or lessening their legal troubles. So what happened in this case initially was he was representing the woman, and she told authorities later on that Mark Benavides told her if she slept with him, that he would, negotiate a better deal than what she was facing for intoxication manslaughter, which is a second-degree felony punishable by 2 to 20 years in prison and a fine. So what ended up happening was Benavides negotiated a deal with prosecutors, and she ended up getting sentenced to 15 years in prison. Well, she told authorities later on, when she blew the whistle on Mark Benavides, that he had told her that he was going to get her probation. So obviously, with a 15-year sentence and a plea deal, that was not something that she was expecting. So she told authorities that Mark Benavides had been coercing her and forcing her to sleep with him. So she was one of the defendants who testified at his trial and was actually featured in the first video that was shown to the trial, which, if you'll recall, right after that first day of testimony in his trafficking trial in Wilson County, a juror had to be dismissed because she passed out after seeing that video. So this woman was definitely the catalyst in what ended up happening with Mark Benavides in his case, because since then, there were numerous women who came out. At his trial, 6 women testified against him. But in paperwork that was filed by the Court of Appeals, they had mentioned in their document that possibly up to 15 women were involved in this particular case. So that is how this particular intoxication manslaughter trial came back to Bexar County, because, it was argued and the court felt that there was enough compelling information for them to send it back to be retried. So she has been retried, and the first phase ended on Friday. So today, the jury this morning will be hearing closing arguments in this case, and the woman who initially in the plea bargain was sentenced to 15 years in prison, found guilty, this time by a jury of her peers, again faces between 2 and 20 years in prison, being convicted of intoxication manslaughter. So this chance will be kind of interesting to see what happens, because she has applied for probation according to court records, but she could either get the same sentence or less, or depending upon what jurors hear in the arguments between the attorneys, she could get the maximum, 20 years in prison. So we'll be talking about this likely again in our next episode.
And then finally, Elizabeth, before we say goodbye, just a few moments left on the topic of Mark Benavides, who's someone we've discussed quite a lot here on the podcast. Do you have any updates on what's going on with him? And I know in the past we've talked about some cases that were pending in addition to the one he was already convicted of.
Right. Yes. Well, on the case that he was convicted of, that continuous trafficking of persons conviction has been appealed, and that currently is going through, the fourth Court of Appeals. So we'll be definitely keeping tabs of what happens in that case. As far as the other 4 cases that were pending against him, that involved probably likely the other people that were mentioned in that document that we discussed earlier, those other cases have already been dismissed. He had a sexual assault charge, a sexual assault of a child charge, and a continuous charge. And I believe actually he might have had 2 sexual assault charges, one child sexual assault and another continuous trafficking. So he did have those 4 cases that were pending, and that we were waiting to see if there would be another change of venue to go to either Wilson, Atascosa, or another neighboring county. But after that, last hearing that we had in the case, those cases have been dismissed. So at this point, we'll probably just be watching to see if indeed Mark Benavides ends up getting, his appeal ends up getting granted, and he will have another trial, or if the original conviction will hold and he will have to serve at least 30 years in prison if his case is not retried.
And that's going to do it for today's episode, Elizabeth. Thank you, as always, for the updates, and have a good week in court. We'll talk to you about a week from now.
Thanks so much, champ.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News Courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio and Bexar County from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.